Jesus has been taken, he's under arrest, he's been taken already. Who did he go to first? Remember, what was the man's name? First person he was taken to, which is not where he was supposed to go, by the way. Remember? Caiaphas is the actual high priest. He went to his father-in-law, Annas. Very good. He was at Annas, who used to be the high priest before he was deposed or basically taken out of his position. And he went to Annas, and Annas questioned him. This was completely extra-legal. This was not supposed to happen. This was not legal under Jewish law. So he goes and he asks him these questions. And finally, they get tired of it, and they send him on to, who does he go to next? Caiaphas. And he goes to Caiaphas, and he stands before him, and he asks him these questions. And what does Jesus reply? He replies what? Nothing. He doesn't say anything. He refuses to speak. Now, this is, for a lot of people, if you ask a question of an innocent man and they don't speak, what's your first impulse? You judge them guilty. You know, if they've got nothing to hide, then they're going to say something. They're going to try to defend themselves. The truth of the matter is, all of the charges against him are false anyway. He did not have to. Let me ask you this. If this trial was going according to Jewish law, and we talked about the ways, remember, what are the ways in which the trial that Jesus was supposed to go through, or if they were going to have a trial for Christ, which he didn't need one, he wasn't guilty of anything, wasn't even accused of anything legally. But if he had been on trial, what were some of the things that we would find very familiar with this idea of a trial that Jesus would be going through? For one, there would have to be what? There would have to be at least two witnesses, and these would be disinterested witnesses. These wouldn't be people who were accusers. The accuser must have witnesses. Another thing is what? He was entitled to a what? He was entitled to representation. There's a reason Jesus is called an intermediary or mediator for us. That term is a legal term, and that term is something that we find under Jewish law. He had to have representation. He did not have. Now, you could go to trial by yourself, but the problem with going to trial by yourself is a lot of times things happen that you don't know what to do, and all of a sudden you find yourself on the wrong end of the stick because you didn't have representation. So he's entitled to representation. He was entitled to have witnesses and to face those witnesses, not just written. Somebody scribbled a note. Yeah, he did this and handed it to the prosecutor. He had the right to confront his accusers. Okay, so that's another one. What else? When was this trial taking place? At nighttime. Extremely illegal. This was not supposed to happen. The only time this trial was supposed to occur is during daylight time. Basically anywhere from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening. After that, legal proceedings stop. Okay, at least a trial. Okay, punishment was to take place during the day. Why do you think that is? So that there could be anyone who desired could come and see what was happening. It was supposed to be done in a very transparent way, and this was not being done. Okay, so that kind of sums up the idea of going to Annas in the first place. He wasn't supposed to be there. So he goes to Caiaphas, and he stands before Caiaphas, and he keeps asking him these questions. And it says that Jesus answered him, not a word. That's the word, not a word. He wouldn't say anything. Finally, Caiaphas says what? What does he say to Jesus? He says, 26:63. Matthew 26:63, he says, this time Caiaphas places Jesus under oath. So he asks him and he charges him with an oath. And what was that oath? I adjure you what? 26:63. Matthew 26:63. I put you by the living God. This is the only time that Jesus answers Caiaphas. And he answers him when he places him under oath, because he places him under oath by his own Father. He said, I adjure you by the living God. And what does he ask him? Or what question was this he was supposed to answer in verse 63? If you are the Christ. Okay. So he asks him by his own Father if he is indeed the son of his own Father. Okay? You see this. You see the irony here. I mean, this idea about what he's asking him. He says, I adjure you by the living God, answer me. Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? And what does he say? Jesus knows he has to answer this because he's been placed under oath by God. And what does he answer him? It is as you said, or there's another translation, thou sayest. Thou sayest. Another one is thou hast said. All of these things he answers him, but when he answers him, is he answering him truthfully? Yes. He said, are you the Son? Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Yes, I am. Now it's interesting because he says, I adjure you by the living God. So he's asking him, when you're given that oath, to fail to answer truthfully in that oath would be, that's beneath contempt. Even the most hardened criminal, when they're asked, and they're asked by the name of the living God, they have to answer that question. So here's Jesus giving them the most truthful answer that he could possibly give. Yes, I am. Thou sayest, thou hast said, whatever. He also refers to him, verse 26:64. Somebody read that for me. Okay, so he also describes himself not only as Jesus Christ, as the Christ, the Son of the living God. He also describes himself as the Son of Man, and he says, "I sit at the right hand of power." So he says, basically, not only is he the Son of God, the Messiah, he's also the Son of Man, and he will be sitting at the right hand of God. He has the power. When it says the right hand of God, that means he is the power of God. When God sends his Son back, when this world is done, when he comes back to destroy this world, and it will be destroyed, it will be burned up with fervent heat, who does he send back to destroy the world? He sends his Son. His Son will be sent back. So who has the power of the Father? Because they are one. Okay. All right. So he refers to himself as the Son of Man who shall come again to judge the world. All right. Now, here it is. They asked him, the old saying, don't ask what you don't want answered. Okay. He asked him, who are you? Are you the Christ? And he says, I am. And he describes himself. And then what does he say? The high priest gives this verdict. Okay. So he gives him the right answer and he gives him a truthful answer. But what did he say? He is guilty of what? Verse 65. Blasphemy. What constitutes the charge of blasphemy at this point? Yeah, yes, at this point, when he says he's guilty of blasphemy, what's the blasphemy? He considers himself to be equal with God. I mean, that's the blasphemy part of it. The blasphemy is that he claims to be the Son of God. Because even the Jews knew, the Hebrews knew that the Son of God, the Messiah, was one with the Father. They have known this from the beginning. And this is who they were waiting on. So this is not just some guy that they had not been expecting to show up and claim to be the Son of God. This is the Messiah that they had been waiting on. They knew who he was. They knew who he was supposed to be. Okay? So they understood that when someone claimed to be the Christ, the Messiah, that he was one with God. So now they've asked him the question. He's answered it truthfully. Now they're going to call him a blasphemer for answering the question that they asked him. They adjured him by the living God to answer truthfully. So I answer it truthfully. Well, now we're going to what? Verse 66. He's guilty of blasphemy and he is worthy of death. Is this an appropriate response to one who has committed blasphemy? Yeah. If there was blasphemy, one who was found guilty of blasphemy on the word of several witnesses stood under, let's put it this way, stood under condemnation of death. Not necessarily was killed, but he stood in condemnation of death. And that was the penalty prescribed for blasphemy for those who committed it. All right, so he stands worthy. And the King James says he is worthy, or he's guilty of death, but other translations say he is worthy of death, where he is deserving of death. And that speaks of the punishment that they felt he deserved. He claims to be the Son of God. He claims to be, and in claiming to be the Son of God, claims to be one with God, or equal to God. So they felt that he was worthy of death. All right. Now, here they've just proclaimed a verdict, and they've proclaimed a punishment for one who feels that they are equal to God. Now, let's shift that just a little bit and talk about ourselves for just one moment. Is it not one of the sins that we commit most often is what? Claiming that we are what? Equal with God, aren't we? Isn't that what we say? Isn't that what the world says, that it's equal with God? When we say that our own thoughts and our own ideas and our own desires are paramount in our lives, what are we saying? Who's coming first? Ourselves, right? Okay? So we've got ourselves, we've got our own desires, we've got our own thoughts, all of these things. In what way are we not claiming to be equal with God? So they've just proclaimed a sentence on Jesus for something that we ourselves are guilty of. Sinners are. We're equal to or even more important than God Almighty. Because we're going to do what we want to do, and God is going to have to take a back seat to what we want, whatever it is. I want this. I want this in my life. I want to be in this position, or I want to have this. I want this relationship. I want this job. I want this lifestyle. I want all of these things, and God's going to have to take a back seat. Well, when we do that, what are we putting in first place? Ourselves. We're saying that we are equal to God by saying that our thoughts and desires are paramount, and we are most important. So when they say this punishment, they're actually telling us what we are not only guilty of, but what we are worthy of when we act in a sinful way. We are guilty of blasphemy, and we are worthy of death. It's such a mind scramble when you think about what they're doing here. Jesus had to die on the cross, but they're crucifying the one person that didn't deserve to die, but he had to die so that we wouldn't be killed for what we've done in our own lives. Everything that they're doing to him should be on us even today. This is where we should be if it weren't for the grace of God, because God through his grace sent his son to die on the cross so that we could become children of his. And if he hadn't, it's a mind scramble. If he hadn't sent his son, this is where we would be right now on that final day. When he says, he's going to read those charges, he's going to say, you're guilty of blasphemy and you're worthy of death. Those prayerfully won't be read to us because they've already been read to him. You see, it's kind of it seems like it's one of those loops. It just keeps going around and around, but that's exactly the way that it is. I mean, I wish there was, I'm kind of like Jesus, I wish there was any other way for this to occur, but there wasn't. And since there was no other way for it to occur, I'm glad it did. Because if it hadn't occurred, this is exactly the punishment we would be guilty of, or that we would stand condemned of when our time is up to stand before God and receive the reward for all of the things that we've done. Okay? All right, so what was his great crime? His great crime was he claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be the Son of God. And in claiming to be Son of God, he claimed to be equal with God. So, what accusation was written over the head of Jesus? 27 verse 37. This is Jesus, King of the Jews. You notice they don't say the Christ. This is the Messiah. Okay, they say this is Jesus, King of the Jews. Now, did they mean this in a grand way of telling the world that, you know, we've done what God needed for us to do, and we're proud of what we've done? We've allowed this all to occur, and we've helped this? Is that what their mindset was? What was their mindset? They meant it in the most hurtful, slanderous possible way. They're going to hang him up here, and it's a mockery. They're making a mockery of this very statement. And you notice what he said. He didn't even say, I am. He said, thou hast said. Thou hast said. Or thou sayest. Saying, you know, you said it. You said it. He didn't even say it. But they made this mockery of him by putting this piece of parchment up above his head, saying, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. Okay, so that was what was written. Much in the same way that anybody else might have a sign that said, I'm a murderer, I'm a thief, I'm a rapist, I'm a killer, I'm a whatever. That's what those guys, the two guys that were crucified on either one of them, they had their crimes posted above their heads. And this is, once again, getting back, that is what our lot would be if it were not for Jesus dying in the middle of those two guys. That's what we would be. We would stand there in front of everybody with our crimes posted above our heads. And it wouldn't be something small. It would be blasphemy because we put ourselves in the place of God. Okay, so was that his crime? Wasn't really a crime. That was who he was. And whether they meant it as a mockery or not, he was labeled correctly. This was Jesus. He was the King of the Jews. He was the Messiah, the one that was sent to keep you people from hell. And what did you do? You nailed him to a stick. I mean, that's what all of this boils down to. I mean, he sent him to you. He sent him to you out of love, and you crucified him out of hate. All right. Here's the awful abuse number 2. We talked about the awful abuse last time. What was the first abuse? Slapped him, right? The guard that was standing next to him in front of Annas, as he spoke these words, the guard hauled off and just clobbered him right in the side of the head. Now, this wouldn't be done in a court of law today. There are standards of conduct. If somebody's standing in the docket and they're having their sentence read and they're asking questions, a guard can't just, or a bailiff can't just come up and sock you one. That's against the law. You're not supposed to do something like that, and they would go up for charges. Now, can they tackle you if you try something foolish? Yeah. You don't be surprised what happens to you if you do something like that, but they can't just haul off and knock you one. Well, that's what happened with Jesus. So what's the awful abuse number 2? After this sentence was pronounced, and the idea here of this sentence is just their idea about what should happen to him. Remember, they did not want, let's back up for just a second. He went to Annas first, and then he went to Caiaphas. Did Caiaphas want to pronounce a sentence on Jesus? No. Why did they not want to pronounce a sentence on Jesus? They didn't want dirty hands, did they? They wanted the Romans to do their dirty work for them. What they're doing is they're setting this up. Every bit of this trial adds a little bit more and adds a little bit more, so that when they finally present him to the Romans, who they want to do their dirty work for them, they have all of this stuff that's been piled up and piled up and piled up and piled up and piled up. And here it's like they're dumping it off on Pilate and saying, you see, we found him guilty of this, we found him guilty of this. And even Pilate sees through this. He says, I find no fault in the man. But after all of this is said and done, this is what they dump off on Pilate. All right? So they've called him a blasphemer. They said that he is worthy of death. And then after this happens, what begins to occur? First, they begin to do what? Verse 67. What did they do to him? They spat in his face. Now, I don't know about you. Let me tell you this. I looked at under strange rules in different states. Different states have those weird little laws and stuff like that you always find so humorous. Some you can't eat ice cream on Sundays. Sometimes there's one that says you can't wash a horse in a bathtub or something. Just really strange words. Do you know in the state of Georgia they have a rule? There's a law, and it's still on the books, and it says that if the only exception for assault is when somebody uses fighting words. That's the terminology, fighting words, which basically means if somebody comes up to you and starts using fighting words, you're entitled to haul off and suck the guy. That's the legal entry into a fight in the state of Georgia. Now, I've never heard anybody use that defense, but it just goes to show that every state has something a little strange on the thing. Okay. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of anything more of a fighting word than somebody coming up and spitting in my face. I mean, I'm sorry, that would take everything I could to just, it'd be like grab a hold and just think about it. Think about it. Remember, this is a man who has all the power of the universe at his command. At any moment, he can end all of this. This idea of power under control. Jesus was completely in control of the situation. They thought they had him. I mean, seriously. You have the Son of God with all the power, and you have his wrist bound in front of him. What do you think that's going to do? If he wants at any time, those things melt away, and he just rains down fire. But that's the whole point. When you think about that idea of them coming up and spitting in his face, and for the one man in the world that doesn't deserve it, for one, and he sits there and he takes it time and time. And this wasn't just one guy. One by one, they come up as he's standing there in front of that little, they have a little thing where you had to stand and you had to listen to yourself being accused as they walked by and they spit in his face. Okay, so this idea, this abuse. And I was looking, and there were very few insults, especially amongst the Jewish people, that were more of an insult than spitting in the face. That was like the highest. Even hitting somebody wasn't as bad as spitting in their face, except it was by plucking the hairs off from his cheeks. This idea of removing the beard, because the beard was you remember the Jews were told you don't even trim the corners of your beard, you allow it to grow. It was something that's much like a woman was not to shave her head, a man was not supposed to shave his beard. Okay, it was supposed to be allowed to grow. And when they would come up and they would pluck hairs from his face, removing the hairs from his face. And we see that in Isaiah 50, verse 6. Okay, this idea of plucking the hairs from the cheeks. All right, so it says they also did what? It says they also, verse 67, they also what him? Buffeted him. What does it mean to buffet? Beat, buffet. It would basically, the idea here is that he's surrounded. And as one of them hits him, it drives him into another one. The other one would take him and they would hit him. This was not like the guard. This is not an idea of taking an open hand and slapping across the face. This is balling up a fist and hitting him. And wherever the blow landed, if it was in the side of the head, if it was on the shoulder, if it was in the arm, wherever it was, they just hit. And as they hit him, he would bounce back and forth between them. So you see this abuse is escalating. Okay, first it was just a slap. Now they've begun to beat him physically with balled fists. Okay, what's that? Well, exactly. When you've got one person that begins it, what's going to happen? When you've got all people, and these people were all in agreement. I mean, when they had them all together, they were all in agreement with this idea about, for one, the verdict, and for another, the guilty, the punishment. So you had a bunch of people who believed and felt the same way. He had nothing that was protecting him. He had no protection whatsoever. There was no one there to keep order on his behalf to keep this from happening. There was nobody there. He had no advocate. You know, Jesus is called our advocate. He had no advocate there. So even if there had been one person there that was taking his side and was making sure that this was done correctly, he had one person that could at least shield him. There was nobody there. He had no one. The apostles weren't even there. They had followed at a distance. They had no part in this. So here he's there. He's by himself amongst an extremely hostile group of people. They're not interested in fairness, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. So it says they begin to beat him. Basically, in description, as a boxer would strike an opponent only without the benefit of having a boxing glove. It's just with bare knuckles. Okay. That says others hit him hard with the what? Verse 67. The palm of their hands, which basically, kind of like we think an open-handed slap or a cuff. And as they punished him with their fists and their open hands, they mocked him and made fun of him and started playing games with him. So this sounds like a bunch of individuals that are no longer acting like civilized human beings. This is just a mob rule. They're going to do as they wish with him what they wish to do with him. In their minds, yeah. In their minds, they've heard a portion of something, a portion of a whole, and they've already made a determination. They knew, but let's be honest. They went into this knowing what they were going to do. These were men who had already conspired ahead of time. So they knew what they wanted to do with him. They just knew that they themselves didn't want to be the ones to do it. They wanted it done for them. Well, like they did with Judas, we can't accept that money back. That's blood money. So they were able to say, well, we didn't take it back into the treasury. That bought someone's, that was the price of betrayal. We don't want that back. That bought someone's death. Okay, so, yeah. trying to remember what they called it. It was a blood libel. Basically, it wasn't until Vatican II under Pope John Paul that finally that curse that the Catholic Church had laid upon the Jews for the death of Christ, they finally lifted that. They held that grudge for 2,000 years against the Jews. The Catholic Church and the Jews were never really good friends to begin with, but they held them responsible for that for years after the fact. The Jews were an unholy group of people because they had Christ killed. Well, a group of Jews 2,000 years ago had Christ killed, yes. But you're right. Even today, the idea here is there was no responsibility at all, none. Well, we read very specifically that they had a responsibility for it. Was it the entire religion? No, absolutely not. There were still followers of Christ. If there weren't followers of Christ, there wouldn't have been a flock to scatter at this time. So there were people there who still believed who he was and certainly didn't want him killed, not knowing, of course, that his death was absolutely necessary. So, but yeah. It says, yeah. Oh, certainly, yeah.
When I was in the Baptist church, this is what we taught.
Yeah.
About the Jews.
And it's interesting that there's that a lot of what people refer to as evangelical Christians still believe that the Jews are God's chosen people. Well, we don't find that. The only people that we find that are promised a home in heaven were those who have become New Testament Christians. Well, you're saying that all Jews are going to hell? That's not what I'm saying. I don't say anything like that. I say, look at the Scriptures and look at the Scriptures say. Can you continue in Judaism and not be a New Testament Christian? And when our time on this earth is over, was God going to look at us and say, well, you were a faithful Jew? Is that going to avail us of anything? No, we have to be a follower of Christ. That's essential. But there are those who believe that God is still waiting to resurrect the lost sheep of Israel, and he's going to bring them back to their place and power and all this kind of stuff. We don't find that. We need to concentrate on what Scripture says. And Scripture says that Christ died for our sins. That it is through Christ, and by no other name are we saved. Okay. All right. We don't have to get too much in this, but it says they even, in Luke 22, verse 64, it says they played a sadistic and cruel game of blind man's bluff, where basically they blindfolded him and they started pushing him around, saying, who was it that hit you this time? Basically making a mockery of his ability to discern. You think you're so great, you think you know us, you think you know everything. Who hit you this time? If you're the Christ, you can tell us who hit you. Who was it? Was it me? And you can imagine, this sounds like a group of sadistic little kids. Sounds like small children that have gotten reins of power, and they're basically acting in a hateful, sadistic way. And if they had maintained a sense of decorum and a sense of purpose, you might at least have some sort of sympathy for the proceedings, but you don't, because you see the way they're actually behaving. This is not the way civilized people behave. And it certainly was illegal in the way that it was done. I mean, nothing about this is it's just outside of the parameters of law, even at that time amongst the Jews. But it was essential that he go to the Jews first. Okay? They had to have their way with him. Because if they had sent him to the Romans with the charges that they had, what would have occurred? Pilate he had already heard all this stuff. And you think he saw through a great deal of the testimony, the so-called testimony that had occurred under these lower courts? He saw through it. He says, he saw a small group of people that really he had a lot of disdain for anyway. Pilate did not want to be where he was. This was a little podunk outpost in the middle of nowhere that no self-respecting Roman wanted to be in charge of. It was nonstop trouble. It had always been trouble in that area, and it always continued to be trouble in that area. He didn't even want to be there. And the last thing he wanted to do was take some man's life on the word of these people squabbling amongst themselves. That's what he saw it as. He saw it as just a religious squabble, and he didn't want any part of it. Okay, let's move on. All right. Okay, so It's funny because what do you think their thought process would have been if when they blindfolded him, they pushed him around and say, "Okay, tell us who hit you." What do you think? What do you think would have happened if he'd actually started telling them? Yeah, okay, first it was that guy, now it was that guy. Oh yeah, I know who hit me this time. Could he have done that just to show off his power? Certainly so. That would have showed him. You think that would have shut him up pretty quickly? Probably so. They'd have stopped that little game. But of course, he kept his mouth shut, and he didn't open his mouth, and they could just continue to abuse him physically.
I can see why Christ faced the 3 times. Because he knew what was going to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The idea of 3 times, meaning, if God's not going to grant it after the 3rd time, there's no sense in continuing on with it. So, yeah, I can imagine not wanting to have to go through this. And this is just the lead up. I mean, this is the what they call the opening card on the way to the main fight. Okay. All right. The Bible doesn't even tell us all the other things they did or said to him. It just merely says, and other things blasphemously they spoke against him in Luke 22:65. But it's obvious who was really guilty of blasphemy. These were people who were denying what? The personage of Christ. Is that blasphemy? Yeah, it is. It's blasphemy to deny the personage of Christ. We will be found guilty of that if that's what we do, as the world will. The world is going to be very surprised at when this life is over. I mean, it's going to be a lot of people are going to be very, very shocked and angry and disappointed because that's exactly what they will be found guilty of. Okay. Now, Luke 22 verses 54 through 62. All right. Round about this time, while they're in Caiaphas, where they're standing before Caiaphas, and he's receiving the shameful treatment. Not only is he receiving shameful treatment from those who withstood him to his face, those who are blaspheming against him, but what's happening in Luke 22 verses 54 through 62? Who wants to read that for me? Luke 22, 54 through 62.
Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intensely at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with them, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're saying." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the words of the Lord, how he said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly.
Okay. Now, what's happening here? We think about these men who are ill-treating Jesus Christ. Why are they doing it? Yeah, to a certain extent it's ignorance. To a certain extent they know exactly what they're wanting to do. I think they do it not knowing what part they're taking in all of this. They have no idea that by doing all of this, they're actually fulfilling the plan of God. They think that they're subverting this. They think they're preventing this thing from occurring, but they don't know that they're actually in the midst of it. They do it out of a sense of anger and a sense of hatred and a sense of ignorance, certainly, evil thoughts, wickedness, certainly. Why does Peter do what he did? Cowardice? A sense of, I look at this. How often do we betray Christ out of a sense of self-preservation? Think about how many times people betray Christ to preserve themselves. All the time, right? I mean, sometimes it's to preserve a reputation that we might have. Okay, I don't know how many times and it's just really doesn't make any sense to me. But I know so many people. I know so many guys that they want to preserve this sense of they're above that. They're smarter than that. You know, they're too smart to believe in God. They're too smart to believe in Jesus. And it's not that they don't believe Him. They just don't want to appear to be an ignorant religious nut. That's their words. They don't want to be some religious nutcase, and they want people to view them in that way. So they're trying to preserve a reputation or something like that. Sometimes it might be to preserve a job. Sometimes it might be preserve an amount of income. And remember, this was not the first or the last time that people will betray Christ in order to preserve themselves. Remember, when the persecution begins coming in, these people are persecuted for becoming Christians and remaining Christians. They're going to be asked this question: do you know Him? Are you with Him? Are you a part of Him? Because look at what he asks him. He says, this man also was with him. All right. So this is obviously someone who may have been an eyewitness while Jesus was in Jerusalem, after he'd come into Jerusalem. This may have been a girl who was, because he wasn't hiding himself, he was everywhere. So this girl probably saw Peter, who was obviously who he was, and she saw him with Jesus. So this is an eyewitness. So the questions that they asked Jesus, that Jesus answered truthfully, Peter's answering untruthfully. You were with him. No, it wasn't. Wasn't me. And you can see him after he answers that, he kind of sidles away because he don't want to get caught up in that again. So he goes over to another part of the courtyard where the fires are going so people can warm themselves. So he goes to another part of the courtyard. And then after a little while, another one saw him and said, you are also of them. Who's them? That band of apostles, right? These followers, these disciples, the ones, his apostles they were right there with him. He was not hiding himself, so there he was with all of his apostles. You're also one of them, that group that was with him. And Peter says, man, I am not. How often do people answer that question? Well, you're one of them. Nope, not me. Or we downplay it. Well, are you a Christian? Yeah, I believe in Jesus. We kind of downplay that whole thing. That's what the world does. We don't want to be caught up in it. Okay? So Peter said, man, I am not. Pretty definite answer. Okay, that leaves no room for doubt. Well, I knew him a little bit, or I was kind of on the periphery. I listened to him a little bit. He says, man, I am not. I mean, that's pretty solid in his answer. Then after about another hour had passed, another confidently affirmed. That's pretty serious. This is basically an eyewitness making a statement, an eyewitness statement. He says, surely this fellow was also with him. And other versions say that your speech betrays you because he spoke like a Galilean. Okay? For he is a Galilean, because his speech betrayed him. He spoke with a regional dialect maybe that kind of pinpointed him as one of these people. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are saying. So 3 times, now once again, the idea of that number 3, at this point, he has well and truly denounced Christ. He has betrayed him. Now we think, well, he didn't really betray him, because we think of betrayal much in the way that Judas betrayed him, right? He came up and he offered Jesus up for a sum of money. But did Peter betray Christ as much as Judas did? He didn't even get the benefit of 40 pieces of silver. Okay. He didn't even get the benefit of the money. But he did exactly the same as Judas did. Exactly the same. There was no difference. The difference is in how Judas and Peter dealt with their betrayal. If Judas had come back and wept bitterly and repented in his heart and was truly sorrowful in the way that he should be sorrowful, what would have happened? Absolutely. Do you think that would have done as Jesus is hanging on that cross, to see Judas come up and stand before that cross and beg for his forgiveness? What would Jesus have done? It would have been within a heartbeat. I mean, it would have taken him no time. Yeah, if he could forgive the people that nailed him there, he certainly could have forgiven the man who gave him up. He didn't nail a single nail. he certainly would have forgiven him. But Judas, instead of taking that, Judas went out and wept bitterly as well, did he not? He was sorrowful that he did what he did. But he didn't go that extra mile to do what he needed to do in order to make that relationship between him and his Savior correct again. What did Peter do? It says he went out and wept bitterly. And what else? We don't read anything else, do we? We have no idea. But we do know this. When Jesus rises from the dead, when he comes back from the dead, he gives instructions. He says, tell these people that I'm coming, and especially tell Peter. Jesus had already forgiven Peter. He wanted Peter to know, I'm coming and I want to see him. It wasn't to come and lay him out for, think Jesus knew this was happening? Of course he did. But did Jesus come to excoriate him and to make him feel? No, Peter already made himself feel pretty bad. He came to forgive him. He came because he loved him. And remember, this is the man who confessed him as the Christ. The first confessed him as the Christ. Remember, he was the first to say that he was the Son of God. Then he betrays that he doesn't know the man. He's not a part of this group. Then who preaches the first gospel, or the what we would call not the head? Wasn't the head apostle. He was the leader of the apostles, certainly. Who preached this as the first gospel sermon? Peter. Okay? So it just goes to show that we all get caught up in something like that. It depends on what our actions are after the fact. How do we deal with our betrayal? Because when we sin, that's what we do every day. We betray him. We nail him to that cross every day that we sin. Okay, we're going to stop there, and then we'll pick up again next week. Thank you for all the comments, and we want to we've got several to pray for, and we're going to continue to pray for that. If there's anyone else that needs to needs prayers of the congregation, we certainly want to pray for you. But we're thankful for you being here, and if you need to respond, I invite you to come while we stand, while we sing.